and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are here. We are returning. It's just you and me, friend singular, and we are getting back to some old school classic Friends Talking Fantasy content today. I'm, of course, referring to our classic series, Friends Pitching Fantasy.
The OGs know. They know.
The OGs know. We are out of books to read, guys. Everything that we have scheduled.
We've read every book.
We've read them all. Every book that we had put on our reading schedule has been read. And now we're looking at ourselves and we're asking, what should we read next? And we also have, episodes that we try and get out every week for you guys. So we're like, hey, why don't we develop a series where we pick what we're going to read next as an episode? And thus Friends Pitching Fantasy was born, and here we are today. We've been doing it a little differently. We're going to do it very similar to the last time we did it. And for those of you that need a little refresher, Dylan is going to pitch 3 books this episode. That is why we are here. These are Dylan's choices. And then I'm going to pick 3 books in the next episode, which will likely air the same week. And then we'll pick one, I'll pick one of Dylan's, Dylan will pick one of mine, and then those are the next 2 books that we're going to read on the show. It's very exciting. We're going to get some audience participation as well. Dylan's going to pitch his books. I'm not going to decide today. I'm going to wait till the end of the week. And that gives us time to share these picks on the socials and get everyone's feedback. So if you're hearing these pitches and you feel strongly about what you want to hear next on the show, definitely let us know over at the FTF Podcast on Instagram and the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end on Twitter. And we will be reading those, taking them into consideration. And I'm sure you all are going to have opinions on Dylan's 3 books that he's nominating for us to read today.
Nailed that explanation there, Charles. I'm excited to get into this. I'm also happy we get to bring some extra content to our listeners this week. I think you said yours is coming out in a couple days after this.
Yeah, I think we'll do a Monday, Wednesday, Friday situation if all goes according to plan.
All right. Let's
Monday
hope it
your
goes
picks,
according to
Wednesday
plan.
my picks, Friday we decide based off of what we read on the socials, and take some time to reflect on the choices and your pitches today, and make sure we're not pressured into a decision live right now. Let's defer and unveil it on Friday. Deliberate.
That sounds like a good plan to me, Charles, and I'm excited to get into this. I do want to give the listeners a heads up that this is my Michael Jordan flu game. I'm struggling with a head cold, but I am. I am grinding through triumphantly. No applause. It's okay, but.
Okay, I knew you were going to say that, which is why I didn't clap.
It just doesn't really pick it up on the mic, when we clap, it doesn't pick it up. But Charles was clapping. I'm sure all of you are very impressed. But I'm sure sound...
Dylan, you are a professional. We appreciate you coming out here. Deadlines are deadlines. Things have to be recorded, and you're doing it for the love of the game, and also just because you're a professional. So we appreciate you coming out, and we will take note and allow you some grace on the audio quality today as well, because you've got a lot of talking to do as you pitch your 3 books here. So I'm thinking you should just say all 3 at the top, and then we'll go one at a time, and you hear your pitches one at a time after that, right? That seems to be the winning formula.
And thank you for clarifying that the reason I brought that up was because of the audio quality and how I might not sound great, because I got kind of caught up in how impressive it was.
How much
that
like
I was
Michael Jordan you are and all that.
Yes, the Michael Jordan comparisons got to my head. So
we don't want to set
anyway,
expectations here that like too high.
Right.
That's assuming you're going to just like captivate us all with your pitches.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure you will. You always do. You always do.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Jordan, yeah, that's pretty high expectations. But maybe like Jamal Murray, the second fiddle on the championship Denver Nuggets squad to Nikola Jokic.
Wow.
So I'm shooting for like a Jamal Murray-like performance.
Well, that metaphor was a slam dunk, but
Nailed it. All right, well, I've got 3 slam dunks for you here. Can't go wrong picks. Number 1 is Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. I realize now I probably should have checked the pronunciation on that before I got into this, but grace
blame
for
it on
me
the
because
blame it on the Michael
of the
Jordan
head
flu.
cold. You know, I normally look up everyone's names beforehand, but you know, even Michael Jordan missed half the shots he took. So apologies to our wonderful author that I am trying to pronounce the name of. Anyway, that is the first book of the now completed Babel Quartet.
Oh.
I don't think it's really called the quartet, but that is a 4-book series. So
Well, I like myself a completed series. That's good.
Next up is A Court of Thorns and Roses by #1 New York Times bestseller Sarah J. Maas. You probably heard of that one. Then next up is The Maleficent 7 by Cameron Johnston, and brought to us by our buddies over at Angry Robots Books. And
Wow.
I'm excited to get into all 3.
Quite a list on, I gotta be honest here. When you shared it with me, I'm like, I only recognize one of these being, of course, A Court of Thorn and Roses, which is immensely popular, which I'm sure you'll get into. And the other 2 are new to me, so I'm actually looking forward to hearing what they're about and why you are bringing them to the FPF table here. And we'll see how they can hold up to like a huge best-selling series like A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. So I'm excited. I'm here learning. This is all so new, so I'm just going to sit here and take it all in.
All right. Well, let's get into it then, Charles. I'm surprised you haven't heard of Senlin Ascends. That one, it's received a decent amount of popularity. I'll get into I'm going to give for each one like a slightly altered version of the little Goodreads summary just to get people kind of acquainted with what the book is about. I made sure all of them were relatively short. So Senlin Ascends, the summary goes as follows. The Tower of Babel is the greatest marvel in the world, with countless ringdoms, warring and peaceful, stacked on top of each other like a layer cake. It is a world of tyrants, mysterious machines, and unusual animals. When there on his honeymoon, Thomas Senlin, the mild-mannered headmaster of a school, gets separated from his wife. Determined to find her, he must navigate the mysteries of the tower. This quiet man of letters must become a man of action as he faces madhouses, assassins, and much more in this often surrealist adventure. Yeah.
Wow. Surrealist adventure.
Yeah, I threw that part in, but that's a lot of people will describe it as surrealist at times, and that's pretty cool. You know, we got into a little bit of surrealist stuff recently with Mark Lawrence's approach to the book that wouldn't burn. Kind of feeling that, and you'll be hearing some of Mark's comments in just a bit, because this book was a competitor in the self-published fantasy blog off, commonly known as Spiffbo, and was later picked up, traditionally published by, I believe, Orbit, It has received massive praise from many in the industry, starting with Mark Lawrence, the mind behind the Spiffbo competition. He called this book one of the best reads he's had in ages, and he's far from alone. A bunch of our buddies in the bookish community that we interact with on social media and beyond, Will Gwynn of the Brothers Gwynn, gave it 5 stars, saying that Senlin Ascends is a book that he would recommend to practically all fantasy readers. We've also got 5-star reviews coming from our friends, reviewers and bloggers, Patrick Leo, Fantasy Book Nerd, Nick Borelli, Nils of the Fantasy Hive, and author of Among Thieves, MJ Kuhn. All of them gave this book 5 stars. We've also had listeners reach out to me personally, Charles, asking us to read this book. And it's ranked 29th in our Fantasy's top fantasy books in their 2023 rankings. So it's received a lot of praise, a lot of accolades, and a decent amount of recognition here. So praise, though, it's great, right? But we don't want to know what strengths we can expect from this novel. Right? And I got into the idea that it has these surrealist elements, and that leads people to overwhelmingly describe the book as unique. So it's got this idea of he is traveling up additional levels of this massive tower, and each one is, from what I can gather, dramatically different from the others. And I mean, I didn't see anyone make this comparison, but it's got a little like Dante's Inferno feel to at least the way that I'm thinking about it. And I think like the trials are so dramatically different. It's like you're stepping into a new world that might have new rules with each successive flight that you climb. And
didn't Bruce Lee do like a Tower of Death, and didn't that have a basketball player in it at the end?
A basketball player?
Didn't it have
like Shaq?
No. It wasn't like I think it's called Tower of. I'm just trying to bring it back home to your basketball references, but I don't know enough about the movie or basketball. I believe it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar into.
Oh,
was he a basketball player?
Chronologically, that makes more sense than Shaq. Aligning with Bruce Lee. Yeah, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a great Lakers player. I think he was famous for his hook shot.
He's super tall, right?
Oh, extremely.
But like tall even for a basketball player. Yes, he was. Yes. Okay, yeah. So yeah, Bruce Lee fights his way like one fight at a time and goes up a floor on his way up a tower. And one of the people he fights towards the end actually is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, basketball player. So there you go. We're bringing this is himself? The kind of Bruce Lee's fighting Kareem as like the final boss.
Yeah, I know. Is Kareem playing himself?
Oh, I don't think so.
Like, is he actually running into basketball player Kareem Abdul-Jabbar?
I don't think so. They may have a different name
played by.
Well, I'll have to check his IMDb. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's IMDb page to find out for sure.
It's not like I have the momentum of a pitch going here that's being
but you're doing great. Just know that if I had been more confident on all my facts, it would have been a great full circle moment. But you're saying lots of levels. It's very exciting.
I thought you were looking up on IMDb.
I am, but it's taking longer than I thought here because he's in a lot more stuff than I was expecting. So now I have to figure out when did this movie come out. So
how about we put a pin in that? And
I'm going to keep looking on this, but I'm all. Oh, he was Hakim in the Game of Death, so he was not. It's called the Game of Death, and he plays a character Hakim, so he does not play himself.
Those rhyme with Kareem, so they didn't.
Unlike Glass Onion, which came out last year, in which Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did play himself. So there you
Kareem. Go. All right. Well. Back to the pitch.
As you were saying.
Yes. Climbing up these levels, I don't know if Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or any other basketball players waiting at the top. But it seems
You're saying
like
challenges, they're not combat challenges necessarily. They're like
some might be. I
right.
mean, I haven't read it, so I'm
Okay.
doing my best to gather what I can without really having known any spoilers coming in. So it sounds like there's all sorts of like challenges and trials. I don't think it's like explicitly like you must like face the Minotaur type challenges. I think it's more like, there's just different things going on, and on his way trying to get up, he's running into all sorts of things that he has to get through. So anyway, and I get the sense this idea of like ringdoms that was mentioned is like kingdoms, but in the ring. I don't know.
I see.
But so this book, it's kind of surrealist. It's got those climb up the tower elements to it. It's also steampunk fantasy setting, and I think between all of that, it's going to come off really original and different. And we talk about how we love books that are a breath of fresh air. Well, Charles, this could be it, especially since most of the tech only releases water vapor, which should keep the air quality pretty good.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. A little sustainability with my steampunk fantasy here. That's great. So
okay, so I'm not done
you're
yet.
You're still
Charles.
pitching.
I'm
okay.
I'm still pitching. So often heard the prose described as poetic. Mark Lawrence called it truly excellent prose and went on to say that so many lines made him deeply jealous. So we know Mark Lawrence is a master of prose in his own right. If you're making Mark Lawrence jealous, he must be doing something extremely well.
For sure.
But Charles, even more important than the prose for you and I as readers, strong characters, especially character motivation and character development. From that earlier description that I read, you can already tell how clear both of these are in this book. I personally really like simple, strong, understandable motivation, right? Motivation to me doesn't have to be overly complex. I like personality to be overly complex and who they actually are, but what they want to accomplish, I think it's easy when you can comprehend it as a reader. And Senlin's search for his lost wife, I mean, it's good motivation and it's easy to understand, and then we can get going with the story. And when it comes to development, it's clear already in that earlier summary too. Senlin, he's in a situation in which he must change and grow. That whole, this quiet man of letters must become a man of action. We'll get to see the extent to which he's able to accomplish that. So we've been enjoying these novels lately that are very focused on one plot line and a particular character. I think of Rage of Dragons. We had an amazing time reading that one. And this, in addition to having a similar origin with being self-published and then picked up traditionally, I think it has that level of focus on one particular character and their very clear motivation. And I'll say, Charles, with all the accolades that I mentioned before, it feels like this is a hole in our resume as fantasy readers and podcasters. We're talking a top 30 book on that R fantasy list, and we've read, I'm pretty sure we've read the majority of the rest of those. So, Charles, I ask you to help me rectify this hole in our resumes by picking Senlin Ascends.
Wow, quite the hook. And I will say it does sound very, very interesting. So this didn't make it to the finals of Spiffbo, but it went on to get, a lot of praise from Mark Lawrence and picked up steam on its own, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
So that is very interesting. And then, let me see. I mean, I'm having a hard time picturing like what kind of book this is. You said steampunk, you said surreal. There is a tower. Is there going to be action in this? Is there going to be like suspense in this? Is this a thriller? Is it going to be like intense and violent? Like, I'm just not sure where I'm going with this, what I'm getting into.
I mean, I don't hear it described as like incredibly violent, but I do hear it described as having a lot of action. I
Okay.
mentioned the idea of assassins, and there's tyrants, and there's these unusual animals, and all that kind of stuff that he's going to have to encounter. And
Right.
like I've said, I haven't read it, so maybe he just like has a pleasant conversation with the assassins to stop them, but I imagine there's going to be some sort of fighting that takes place, and I think it's going to have a lot of those things. I think it's interesting looking through the reviews. People have trouble putting a finger on how to describe this book, and then you get these words. Like I always think about this with when you look up reviews on books, you'll see these kind of like common threads of what words get used. So this one, and I'll mention that later in another book, because I think those are always worth noting when you're deciding on a book. It's the ones that come up a lot for this one are unique, original, surrealist. Like that is the most common stuff, but you'll get a lot of these reviews that are like, I don't even know where to start, but this book was amazing. And even like Will Gwyn, he noted like this was very different from anything that I've read, and like it might not be something that a lot of traditional fantasy folks would typically pick up, and that's where he threw in that line about like, but I would still recommend it to practically all fantasy readers.
Interesting. Yeah, I do like the sounds of that. After reading, as much fantasy as we have in as short of a time period as we often do, the idea of that something new you were even alluding to earlier in your pitch is interesting. I'm wondering, I guess, now that the whole quartet is out, you mentioned that the last book came out. Have you heard any buzz about the series as a whole? Like, does this book stand alone, or does it need to go on to the full series? And did they stick the landing, which I know can be tricky sometimes, and 4 books is a big ask. So have you picked up anything on that?
From what I can gather, it sounds like, and I was staying away from things that got too much into like the ending is like this, but from what I can gather, it sounds like it's got that sort of standalone with sequel potential feel to the first book. And then after he went from like hardly having any reviews on Goodreads until he entered the competition and picked up steam, as you say, Charles. Like, I think after that is when he started writing the rest. I could be wrong, or at least he was like publishing the rest. I have to look into that, but my understanding is the book stood alone pretty well and has a finish to it, even though I don't know. I think we'll get a resolution to this main story of like he's seeking his wife, and we'll see what happens. I'm sure that there's a lot more fodder for storytelling with all of these different ringdoms and that kind of stuff, and I imagine that's where he'll pick up, but again, I haven't read it, so can't tell you for sure. But I never see people being like, this is clearly just a setup book, and there's not a lot of comments like that.
Interesting. Well, I'm very intrigued, and I think I've got what I need to. I guess the only other thing I see is like, I see that Fonda Lee's Greenbone saga is under the also enjoyed here. So I guess to me that says there may be more kind of action in here than maybe I was thinking there originally was when I hear things like surreal. So could be interesting. Interested in. It's certainly a contender for sure. I'm curious to learn more about these other 2 books, but strong pitch right out of the gate.
Thank you. I got by with a little help from my friends. Definitely was drawing from, especially what friend of the show, Mark Lawrence, was saying. But that's what friends are for, Charles.
Absolutely.
Yes. And I think that this next series, and time to get into it, needs very little introduction. It is massively popular, which I'll get into. So it's A Court of Thorns and Roses, like I said, by Sarah J. Maas. This is a book that my girlfriend keeps bugging me to read, and now I have the opportunity to put the ball in your court to stick with our basketball metaphor, I think. And now I can blame you for not picking it if we don't end up reading it. So this is...
Can you, though?
Yeah. I will. I guarantee you that. Yes. Also, credit to her for helping me a lot with this pitch, because she's read the series very in depth and read everything that's out. So she knows a lot more than me. All right, a little summary. When 19-year-old huntress Feyre kills a wolf in the woods. My normal pronunciation game just not on point today, but at least it's a character name instead of an author name. Feyre kills a wolf in the woods. A terrifying creature arrives to demand retribution. Dragged to a treacherous magical land she knows about only from legends, Feyre discovers that her captor is not truly a beast, but one of the lethal immortal fairies who once ruled her world. At least he's not a beast all the time. But something is not right in the fairylands. An ancient, wicked shadow is growing, and Feyre must find a way to stop it or doom Tamlin, who I presume is the beast, and his world forever. And apparently this is loosely a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Although I've seen folks say that might not be the best way to think of it coming in, because pretty different.
Okay.
All right. The core of my pitch for this one, Charles, is that this is a book and series with an absolutely massive fan base and a reception that is probably unlike anything that we've read on this podcast before, besides Lord of the Rings. And I mean, we didn't end up, we've not read A Song of Ice and Fire for this podcast either. So I would say not... that's not in the mix, that we've talked about a bunch of times for other reasons. But yes, this is hugely massive success in terms of its sales and also in terms of its ratings on Goodreads. Over 1.6 million ratings on Goodreads.
So many ratings. That is an insane number.
It is, yeah. And to try to put that in perspective for any folks who aren't avid Goodreads users, although once you're getting into millions, I think most can appreciate that's a lot. Yeah. But compare it to Way of Kings, for example, another massively successful fantasy book by Brandon Sanderson. That book has 435,000, a fourth of the ratings, very positive ratings, but a fourth of them. So This is way more popular than even Sanderson's work in terms of sales and number of ratings and all that kind of stuff. So among these 1.6 million ratings on Goodreads, 1.3 million are 4 or 5 star ratings. Pretty good to have 1.3 million 4 or 5 star ratings.
Absolutely insane.
And that's it's 5.
It's all of my pitches combined, times 5 would get to yours to get to Court of Thorns and Roses.
And I mean, this is at that level of book popularity where you just see it everywhere, right? You go to your local cafe and you look over and someone's reading A Court of Thorns.
I mean, you go to Target and you see it. You know how many fantasy books are in Target? A Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, and that's it. And then this, apparently.
I
and then
see Sanderson there. Although it's the Super Target by me, so maybe that only made it to the Super Target.
Well, look at you. But no, I mean,
not to brag.
That's how you know it's one of those crossover massive hits, when the distribution is everywhere and it's just so easy to recommend and easy to stock and store in your big stores that aren't necessarily niche bookshops. So it's pretty impressive, the amount of success that this series has achieved in a short amount of time. Because I'm trying to think of when did this first book came out? 2015, and you have 1.7 or almost 1.7 million ratings. Dang, that is so much. New York Times international best-selling author. Whoa. Big deal. That I know nothing about. Nothing about.
Yeah, and that's what I'm here to help you with, Charles. I'm going to do my best to educate you on a book I've never read, but but I gathered a lot of information about. And yeah, I think though, to go back, core of the pitch, there are a ton of listeners and potential listeners out there who I think we can reach, and hopefully will really appreciate us taking a crack at this book, which might be a little bit out of our wheelhouse compared to most of what we cover. But Charles, we're open-minded, adventurous folks, and
Certainly.
we're willing to give this a try. But Charles, it will be up to you whether we do that or not. So the books fall into what I'd call a fantasy romance subgenre. And series, it has a reputation for spiciness, Charles.
Oh, yes.
I know that's not your typical jam when it comes to reading. Although we've read our fair share of books that have sex scenes and stuff in them.
Certainly.
But from what I hear, there's also a lot more to sink your teeth into than just romance. There's politicking, there's action. My girlfriend says that even if you remove the romance, it'd still be a compelling read. Although you shouldn't remove the romance because that's probably the part of the book that receives the most praise. I also gather, as you kind of got at, that people find this book very readable, accessible, and often described as addictive. So I don't think it's going to be one of those books that is arduous to get through. I know we've had some times where we're reading these like huge tomes, and even if we're enjoying them, we're like, oh, this is kind of becoming a chore and we have a deadline, all that kind of stuff. I don't think we're going to run into that problem. It's a little over 400 pages or maybe close to 450, but we're pretty used to that length, and I think it reads very easy, and I don't think you sell enough copies to get 1.6 million ratings without it being pretty accessible. So,
Sure.
Charles, I mean, we're coming back to this idea that the book probably isn't written primarily for our demographic, right? I'm guessing that Sarah J. Maas wasn't thinking of you and me when she was thinking what her target audience was going to be like. But we've seen folks, and I know, Charles, you've heard from folks who, like people holding all sorts of different identities who enjoy this book. I know, you got reached out to by one of our high school buddies, and he was suggesting it. So
I'll say think, while you've brought it up that not to ruin your flow because you're on fire, but I think this speaks more to my own personal ignorance than the way the book markets itself. But I thought this was like another Twilight kind of thing, where it's romance, fantasy, like very like pop culture-y, fun, entertainment-driven read. That's what I thought, based off of nothing other than like reading a description very quickly, seeing it in all kinds of places. All kinds of bookstores and stuff, and seeing it just, be popular everywhere. I was like, oh, okay, got it. But then, like you were saying, people of all walks of life are recommending it and saying it's good. And like 1.6 million ratings, average 4.2. It's like obviously very, very good. And then, a very close personal friend of mine that back from our high school was like, oh, have you heard of this book? Like, I know you like fantasy books. Have you read A Court of Thorns and Roses? And I was like, whoa, I mean, this guy was like varsity wrestler. So all the preconceived notions I had of the book were shattered. And then now you were pitching it, and I was like, okay, like there's something more going on here than I originally gave it the credit for. And I am intrigued for sure.
That's well said, Charles. I think that the similarities to Twilight pretty much stop at it's massively popular and
no one is saying it's like Twilight. I just thought it was. no one is saying that it is. To be clear.
I think, and I understand the temptation when you see a book get that massively popular, but I don't think that it's like that from anything that I can gather.
And I will say, though, and the readers also enjoyed, you click that one or two times and you get to the, stud with the open button-down shirt and that six-pack abs and stuff. So it's in that world, but you have to click twice to get there. You have to go through 2 pages of recommended to get there. So it's adjacent. It's adjacent, but that's not what it is. It's the vibe I'm getting now that I'm actually researching it.
For sure, the spiciness, especially from what I hear later in the series, more so than this first book, the spiciness is a key part of these novels. I think that there's lots of people who read it primarily for that, and I think that that can evoke the like 50 Shades of Grey type things in our heads. And if people read it for that reason, more power to them. It's just that I know you and I, Charles, that's not what we look for from our books.
Right.
And so I think it's like the only reason to. You're also not someone who's like, I can't read the spiciness. Like, that's gonna be trouble
I like
for me.
spiciness.
Like, you can handle it. Ooh, Charles. Oh yeah.
Well, if it's good, I'll read anything if it's good.
All right, and that's what I'm counting on when I'm pitching this book to you, Charles. And I think here's the thing: we can offer probably a different perspective than most folks who are discussing this series because we come from more of that like epic fantasy tradition, and now we're stepping a little bit more, if we read this, into that fantasy romance. And we're probably, most other podcasts I see cover this and are folks that are kind of more generally in the fantasy romance or stepping over from the romance side of things. And hopefully, we might not be most of the people discussing it, but maybe that means we'll come with a interesting, different perspective. Anyway, going on to more of the qualities of the books. Heard good things about the main character, strong female character. Rest of the cast often described as complex as well, including the villains. Always love a good villain. People have positive things to say about the world building. Faerie world and its characteristics are described as engaging and immersive, especially as they contrast with the human world in the book, which is more mundane, of course. You get into history and lore of the fairies, which I think, it shows the investment of Sarah J. Maas into writing a whole holistic fantasy book that is a fantasy romance.
So is this young adult, by the way?
Spice. No.
Oh.
It's like, so I believe she's written a young adult series. I could be wrong about that. But this is not young adult.
It's getting tagged as young adult under the genres here, but
that's like the classic, like a woman writes a fantasy book and it gets really popular and people are like, this is young adult. And it's like, well, if you read it, there's stuff we wouldn't put in a young adult book. So I've seen it shelved in the young adult. Yeah. I've seen it shelved in the young adult, like sections of bookstores. And to my knowledge, that is incorrect. It's just like basically stereotyping.
I feel like some people are like, oh, fantasy can't be popular unless it's young adult. It's like, what? Okay, sure. Yeah. So, all right. Well, another fantastic pick. I mean, I just cannot believe how popular they are. A huge success. It'd be crazy not to pick it if you didn't pick two other fantastic books to pitch as well. Gave me a lot to think about this one. On one hand, it's like it's super, super popular, so everyone knows about it. But on the other hand, it's like we know nothing about it. What are we missing? Right. 1.6 million people, 12 million copies, however many dozens of languages, like 37 languages. It's like, what are we missing out on? How could this be that we haven't?
That's what I think, Charles. 1.3 million people can't be wrong. The 4 and 5 star reviewers. This is your opportunity to see what all the fuss is about.
12 million copies, 37 languages.
That's a lot.
What are we missing? That's all I need as far as a pitch is like, what the heck is going on here? What is the story? What is
Only
this
one
story?
way to find out, Charles.
It's like captivated people like I haven't seen in a while. So it's very interesting, very intriguing.
I believe they're developing a TV series as well.
Oh, I mean, they've got to be developing something. Is this series completed, by the way? I don't know what I'm looking at.
I do not think so.
Okay.
I think it is not completed.
Exciting.
They're waiting on at least one more book. But I think they're like 5 out, one of which is a novella.
Right, that's what I'm seeing. Like one is called like 3.5 or something. So there's like 5 books, but They're saying
It might
book
be
number
4.
5 of the series is going to come out
Gotcha.
later. Okay. Well, thanks for the pitch, Dylan. We'll see if I can decide on it. But you've brought this very interesting, exciting, original Spiffbo darling, and then you brought this like international sensation. So I'm curious to see what you brought in as your third pick.
My third pick, I mean, you know it. It's the Maleficent 7 by Cameron Johnston, but you probably don't know much about it because you said
I know the title, but that's about the end of it.
A Court of Thorns and Roses. And even that one, Charles, you sound like you felt woefully ignorant on as well. So
for sure.
A lot of new stuff for you here, Charles. I said I was going to keep you on your toes with this one. I know a little sneak peek into the upcoming episode. You might be bringing some heavy hitters that we're very well acquainted with. So
yes.
Yeah, so I brought some stuff that's a little different here, Charles. And The Maleficent 7 is surely different. And this is a book that I'm currently reading. I started it already.
Okay.
I'm like 40 pages in, so not that far. But I have a sense for it at a little bit more, a little bit more of a sense of it than the books I haven't started yet. So, summary coming. Black Heron was a demonologist and the most ruthless general in all Essaran. She assembled the 6 most fearsome warriors to captain her armies, a necromancer, a vampire lord, a demigod, an orcish war leader, a pirate queen, and a twisted alchemist. Together they brought the continent to its knees until she abandoned her army on the eve of total victory. 40 years later, she must bring her former captains back together for one final stand in the small town of Tarnbrook against a fanatical new enemy tearing through the land intent on finishing the job Black Heron started years before. 7 bloodthirsty monsters, one town, their last hope. Yeah, Goodreads really nailed it with that one. So
my one question is, who abandons their army? It doesn't. Seems like an unusual move.
The kids say Raffo. Read and find out, Charles.
All right, fair.
Yep, this book right up our alleys. It's a grim, dark novel that maintains a sense of humor, frequently described as clever and witty and funny. But the absolute best way I've heard this book described comes from author Rob Hayes, who said, "The Maleficent 7 is like Kings of the Wild smushed together with Suicide Squad into a glorious, gory, sweary melee." I mean, Charles,
glorious,
is that not
gory,
a perfect book
sweaty
for you?
Melee? He's got a way with words. Sweary. I love that.
Sometimes we hear what we want to hear.
I'm still, I'm still in Court of Thorns and Roses mentality. I'm shifting gears right now.
Right.
We're doing a bit of an abrupt turn here. We're going from sweaty to sweary.
Right. Yes, Rob Hayes has a way with words, and I don't know. That sounds really appealing, right? It's like Kings of the Wild in its elements of getting the gang back together long after their prime, right? These past their prime, great warriors of old, but it's with villains instead of the mostly heroic, although complex, characters in Kings of the Wild. And much darker, much grittier, but it is kind of like bizarro Kings of the Wild. And I know how much we both loved that book, and Nicholas Eames is a total delight.
Total delight.
I can gather already that this book is fun, fast-paced, and chaotic in all the right ways. Also a standalone. I know you like that, Charles. You like things to be over
exciting.
And done with. So once we finish it, we'll have a nice, conclusive ending. And part of what I love about this book, and I've seen it already so far in the first 40 pages, part of what I love about it and its concept is it is entirely and utterly unafraid to lean into fantasy to its fullest extent in service of entertainment. I think Yeah, I like there's this trend, and we've talked about some, Charles. I feel like there's this trend really since A Song of Ice and Fire, this big push to eschew the more campy feeling aspects of fantasy in favor of the gritty, realistic, low fantasy feeling.
For sure.
And this is especially true in the grimdark subgenre. And we love a lot of books like that, but
We do.
it does make you long at times for something that goes all in on the fantastical. And this is kind of cool because it's willing to do that while also embracing some of those grimdark elements that we really love. And in this book, we have, I mean, I mentioned some of it before. We have necromancers messing with the dead, gods getting involved directly, demonologists summoning demons and creatures, and vampires presumably sucking people's blood. I haven't gotten to that part yet. And much more of that nature. It's like really willing to go to those extents with the fantastical elements. It's not like this is basically medieval Europe, but like there's creatures in the north that might come 4 books later. It's which, you know, not to crap on one of my favorite series of all time, but I do feel sometimes it's like that's become more prevalent, and we're more recently getting this kind of renaissance of the more fantastical elements.
Nice.
Anyway, Charles, you've described at times how important it is that authors are not afraid to entertain. That's why I was emphasizing that earlier. Because we've read books that can seem to sacrifice the fun and entertainment factor in favor of trying to hit on the capital L literature feel. And we know books that are able to like walk the line extremely well, find some capital L and also be extremely entertaining, right? Like Poppy War is a great example of that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and Arf Kwong, I mean, that's she's definitely leaning into a lot of capital L literature stuff lately. I read Yellowface, which is very good. But anyway, going on. Maleficent 7, I think you'll find a book that will hit the entertainment notes extremely well. If you peruse the reviews of this book, the words you're going to see, like I was talking about before, the ones that come up, fun, entertaining. Another one that comes up a lot is bloody. I know you were worried that Senlin Ascends wouldn't have the blood and the guts that you want so bad, Charles. I mean, we just read The Judas Blossom, which is talking about its historical fantasy Mongolian empire. So Charles somehow was not satiated from all the blood in that. He needs more. Well, he's going to find it if
I
he
don't remember saying any of
Maleficent,
that, but okay, we'll roll with it.
He said it. I think, just off the air. I think there'll be very few, if any, dull moments in this one. People laud how many battles there are in this book and how well written the fight and battle scenes are. And overall, I just think we're going to have an awesome time reading this one together if you end up choosing it. But I'm going to be reading this anyway, Charles. The only question is, will you join me?
Oh, proposition. I mean, it sounds very interesting, intriguing, exciting. I'm wondering, how did you come across this book? Because it's relatively
just
new,
seeing
right?
it on relatively, I think 2021.
Okay.
I'll double check that. It is, it's one that has definitely picked up steam on social media. So I'd kind of, how books kind of like you see them a few times, they're kind of like in your headspace, and then you go into the bookstore and then you see it and you're like, you know what? I'm going to buy this book. It was kind of one of those situations, and I've been meaning to read it for a while. It's just we've been busy with all sorts of other stuff, and we love Angry Robot, so it's a great opportunity to read another Angry Robot books installment, and our friends I could probably pull up a few of like similar how I did with Senlin Ascends, like a few of our friends on Twitter talking about how
I see, William Gwynn, Rob Hayes, like a couple familiar faces here. Well, it sounds like you can't go wrong, and I love when books are entertaining. Dylan, when you originally sent me like your picks and you just sent me the titles, you didn't send me the authors, I was thinking this was Sebastian de Castell's book,
Oh, not
the
the Malevolent
Malevolent
Seven.
Seven. This is
Not
the
the Malevolent
Maleficent
Seven,
Seven.
No. How could you possibly make that mistake?
How could I
mean,
possibly?
you getting Malevolent confused with Maleficent.
Because I was like, oh, I've been kind of wanting to read that too. That book's been like passed around our recommendations for years. So I was like, ooh, and I haven't read a Sebastian de Castell book. But the Maleficent Seven is another one. It sounds like both are definitely worthy of checking out. But the Maleficent 7 is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. And you bring up a good pitch. I appreciate that you threw something in there because, sometimes the surrealists and like the towers and this and that, like you're kind of like, okay, I'm going to have to do some work here to kind of process this story. And then, Sarah J. Maas, of course, popular. But this one is like, hey, you want 7 different, this like ensemble cast of classic fantasy here, your vampires and your mages and your whatnot, just kicking ass. I'm like, okay, I'm down for that too. A lot to think about here. I love my bloodthirsty monsters. When they're down to their last hope, so that's very exciting. And man, I would have never predicted these 3 books for you to come to today, ever. So I'm intrigued, and I have a lot of processing to do because I didn't know these books existed until you first shared them with me. 2 of them, anyway. One of them, obviously, I was aware of because it's an international bestseller. So, very exciting stuff. I'm excited to jump into something totally new. Sometimes things are on your TBR for a while. You're thinking about them. You're preparing to read them. These are just like, hey, this is just jumping ahead on the pile and here you go. Don't think too much about it. Just start reading. So that's very exciting. And I do not think you can go wrong with any of these picks, Dylan. Certainly, you did a fantastic job today. I'm curious to see what the internet has to say. I'm especially curious, because I know Court of Thorns and Roses is by far the most popular. But will that translate over into the audience base that we've cultivated? Are they going to vote for that? I'm super interested to see where the interest lies amongst the people that we chat with on social media. Are they going to want to hear it?
Right?
Because I'm super curious about what this phenomenon's all about. But is that going to resonate with the listeners?
Well, we always are looking for new listeners too, Charles. We love our old listeners.
True. That's true.
We also love new listeners. Yeah, I'm curious too. It's funny to think that I'm like, oh, I really think that Senlin Ascends and Maleficent 7 can kind of hold their own in a Twitter poll from our account. But because our following is tailored to people who are a little bit more in that epic or grimdark fantasy area, and then it's and we have lots of folks that we associate with who are involved with Spiffbo. I used to be involved in Spiffbo, so it would not be shocking if those can hold their own with the book that has 1.6 million ratings.
Right.
We'll see. I'm curious.
Right. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna BS the listeners right now, but I am super interested in Court of Thorns and Roses, and I'm not picking today, but that is certainly the front runner right now. And then I'm also super interested in Senlin Ascends, and I feel like the Maleficent 7 you're already reading. I'm like, let's have him finish that and he can tell me all about it. And then, but that's just where we're anything could happen. Anything could happen. It's up to the fans. If, you want Maleficent 7 to be read, I got to hear it. I got to hear it in the socials. But it is, I am going to be itching to pick that up if we don't read it now. It sounds like one of those quick, fun reads. If I'm going on vacation or something, I'm taking that with me, So, but maybe I'll pick it up on FPF. We'll never know. We'll have to find out on Friday. But yeah, that's where I'm standing today. A very interesting blend of picks, and I'd be more than happy to read any of these next. It's just a matter of what. And I'm going to wait until I hear back from the internet before I make my final decision, but I figured I'd share where my headspace is at as we close out the episode.
Very transparent of you, Charles. Arguably too transparent, but will persevere, much like me, through.
We'll be curious. I've never done that before, but I feel like I've already decided. Like, you've given me some really tough ones to choose where it's like, who am I going to upset by picking now, including myself with some previous picks. These books are so different from each other that it kind of, I don't know, it makes it a little easier to narrow down, but at the same time, it's like, I'm so curious to see what the reaction is going to be to the poll you put up on this, because to your point, Dylan, the one is obviously way more popular than the others, but are they going to be close just because of people that we're talking to are people that read fantasy all the time and would gravitate towards these other books quite strongly? So yeah, really, really very good picks. I'm thank you for bringing them to the table, and let's go. Let's pick them up. Let's get it out there. I'm curious to see what you'll think of mine. I think you'll have heard of all of them.
Well, only one way to find out, Charles. We're going to have to move on to the next episode and see. I think that, I've done everything I can for these books. It is in your hands now, Charles. What's your Twitter again? Like your handle? I'll tell the listeners to contact you directly if they want you to pick.
Just go to the FTF podcast. That's the official one.
You can reach Charles at Charles_MC_. Really drawing from that Mark Lawrence influence with the double underscore there, Charles.
Was not meant to be discovered and promoted. It was so I could browse without accidentally doing something on the FTF account, which I have been known to do many times.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't stop you, but yep, tweet at
It's
Charles
hard to tell what account you're logged into
send.
when you hit a notification. You assume you're on your personal. Sometimes you're on the show account. Things happen. Oops. Things happen. But I think, Dylan, like you said, you've done all you can do for these three very excellent books. I think all that's left to do now is play that sweet, sweet outro music.
I think so too. I'm dying over here, Charles.
All right, let's get this pumping. Let's give Dylan's voice a rest, because we're about to jump into me rambling all about my books. So, Dylan, thank you for persevering, Michael Jordan style. Fantastic job. And I'm going to get this outro music pumping for you.
Let's get that sweet outro.
Did I cut you off
Let's
there?
Get that sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, let us know and go and support us over on the socials. And now more than ever, it's very important you find us over there to let us know what you think of Dylan's picks and then my upcoming picks as well. That's over at the FTF Podcast on Instagram, and then the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. Now, Dylan, if they like what they heard today and they want to support the show even more than reaching out to us over on the socials, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify, where most of you are listening. It's just 2 clicks over at the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast feed. It helps us so much. You can also toss us 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts. You can rate and you can review if you want to. If you write a nice review, it always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you all so much for listening. You guys are awesome. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.